Yeah, so I went with the broad title in part because I've had a lot of fun recently looking into all of the things that opioids do, and I've included a lot of very nice videos. So we will get to the expectations, but like bear with me when we talk about. I'm going to start by talking about what opioids do in terms of their side effects. So what you're seeing here on the main screen is a word cloud that we generated from one of our studies where surgery patients are getting opioids in any case on the right before surgery, and we ask them what they feel, and they feel a lot of different things, which is what got me interested in opioids in the first place. Right, let's see if I can click. That should do it. So, since about 1900, opioids have only really been approved as pain medications. And when that happened, we decided that all of the other effects that these medications have are essentially side effects. This is a move made to avoid addiction crisis from having opioids everywhere. And I guess we can all question how well that strategy has worked out. But on the other hand, if we hadn't restricted it, it probably would have been worse. Um, but I'm interested in these side effects of opioids. Um, and of course, many of you will be in the pain field, so you will know that opioids are considered the endogenous, like the main system for regulating pain. And we've known for a long time about the pain modulatory circuit that recruits endogenous opioids to reduce pain signals through the spinal cord. But if you look at the map of endogenous opioids or opioid receptors in the brain, you see that we have them almost everywhere, and there are also loads of mu-opioid receptors throughout the intestines and other parts of the body. And what's really, I think, fascinating is that in the brain, there are loads of circuits, what I call microcircuits, I guess because they're typically described in mouse brains, that recruit endogenous opioids to fulfill certain specific tasks, such as there's the fasting eating circuit from the dorsal raphe nucleus to the accumbens, in which basically if you fast for 24 hours and you're a mouse, you will typically eat more, but not so much if you block endogenous opioids. Then there's from the Cambridge tradition mapping out of opioid sensitive circuits that seem to where and opioids and other compounds seem to increase the liking of substances as they measure with tongue protrusions. And then there's one of my new favorite circuits, the dessert circuit. So there's a endorphin mediated circuit from the hypothalamus to the thalamus in the mouse. That means that when the mouse is sated, it, just like us, wants dessert. And if you block this circuit, it doesn't. So, but then it doesn't, it gets a lot weirder in terms of the circuits. So many of you may know that many cats are attracted to a substance known as catnip. So this is a kind of plant that seems to make cats rub against it. You may not know, as I didn't, that this goes for the big cats too. So this is, and you can extract the ingredient from catnip and perfume areas, and you can actually then observe things like a tiger rubbing against the catnip area. This behavior is also thought to be opioid mediated. And the function seems to be that catnip contains a molecule that works as a mosquito repellent in cats. So I'm going to go on to pigs next, because it turns out opioids really do seem to play a role for a lot of different type of behaviors. So they've done a neuroimaging with opioid ligands in Göttingen mini pig, which is a large omnivorous animal with a well-developed brain. So you can measure it, and essentially, if you give the pigs a lot of sugar for a few weeks, they seem to have a decrease in opioid receptor density, specifically located in the nucleus accumbens. So this is thought to be telling us also about what happens when we humans eat a lot of sweets. And they've done manipulations also drawing on these other behaviors. Like a lot of pigs are also, in addition to having nice brains for imaging, they're very cute, and they like to be to have a good cuddle with humans. So Suzanne Trung and her colleagues in Melbourne ran this a delightful study where they basically tested uh, pigs either together or in separation, and they tested whether endogenous opioids would be involved in social behaviors towards humans in the mini pigs. And it turns out if you block endogenous opioids, they take longer to approach the human to have this kind of cuddle. And at this point, you're like, what? What do opioids really do? That is approximately the place I'm trying to get you to, because that's where I've sort of spent my research life, I would say approximately for the last 20 years. So we're now going to get to the fish. So, and it's not just any fish. This is a beautiful paper in basically studying butterfly fish and being cleaned by cleaner fish. So I pushed this video from Facebook. These are actual butterfly fish in the wild approaching a cleaner station, and these are the little cleaner fish. So this group in Portugal and Brazil basically ran a study in, in fish tanks where they manipulated the opioid state in both direction of the butterfly fish and found that the butterfly fish develop a preference for going into the side of the aquarium or the tank where the cleaner fish are. This is reduced when they reduce endogenous opioids, and it's also boosted when they give an agonist to strengthen the system. So what do opioids really do, and why do we use them just for pain relief? If we have all of these other behaviors. So in the field for a long time, we've had this notion that opioids are really mainly important for changing how we feel, whereas dopamine is more of a sort of motivational or learning type system. But actually, in the pain field, that's not really what we think. We use painkillers to regulate the experience of pain rather than motivation or behavior. But the theories, if you go back to Howard Fields, his descending pain, his sort of motivation decision model actually really highlights that the descending pain regulatory system evolved to facilitate behavior, and specifically that when you have a motivational conflict, such as these little mice trained to receive chocolate on a hot plate, when they're in a context where there's conflict, because if I stay on the hot plate, I might get chocolate, you basically downregulate pain. Whereas if you are in a dangerous situation, you upregulate pain. This is what the descending pain regulatory system is all about. So one of the thoughts that I'm hoping to leave you with is that opioids might be more important for regulating behavior. And it might do so partly through regulating experience, but as you'll see in some of our data, certainly there are direct motivational effects that don't seem to go through experience as well. All right, now we're going to get to the bit where opioids maybe defy expectations a little bit, because certainly when I started studying opioids 20 years ago, they were known or considered, sort of broadly speaking, as the most powerful analgesics. I just put this into Google Scholar just to draw out this phrase, the most powerful analgesics, is still floating about, although people are maybe now saying there are some of the most powerful analgesics. Nevertheless, I'm certainly going to question whether opioids are the most powerful analgesics, but I just do want to highlight that I'm not questioning whether opioids work for pain in certain circumstances. What I want to say is that the literature is really clear on the fact that we lack evidence that opioids are better than non-opioid alternatives. This can be seen from Cochrane reviews, number needed to treat league tables, and network meta-analyses. And since I'm not a physician, and physicians like to learn from physicians, I will also highlight to you this review from the New England Journal in 2020, where this belief that opioids are uniquely powerful for pain control is listed as a myth. I will, however, highlight that there are some ways that opioids really are most powerful, and it is in their lack of a ceiling effect. If, and this is a major if, you can keep up titrating the opioid dose if you have need for really high pain relief, you can keep up titrating the dose until it's no longer sustainable because of the side effects. And this is not often considered too much of a problem in hospital care, because if your patient stops breathing, which is one of the most powerful side effects of an opioid, you can ventilate, you can keep them alive. But of course, overdose death through the major side effect that people stop breathing, is a major problem worldwide. So opioids are not necessarily uniquely powerful analgesics, but they are uniquely powerful in certain circumstances. I will then, so the idea is that yes, you get better pain relief with an opioid than you typically do with a placebo, certainly for acute pain. And what's not that commonly known is that it's just not typically that much better, or actually better at all, than the pain relief you get from a non-opioid analgesic. And you can see the references here on the side. I'm going to show you a few head-to-head comparative trials because I find them illustrative. So if you wonder if opioids are best for instance, acute extremity pain, I made this figure from a table in this JAMA paper. These are patients, each of these are groups of 100 patients who have extremely strong pain. They're typically starting out at a 9 out of 10. And then they are randomized to one of 4 medication combinations. Only the first one doesn't contain an opioid. They all contain acetaminophen, which is paracetamol in European. And they all have essentially identical pain trajectories, right? It doesn't seem to matter if you include an opioid in any of these or not. This is then replicated. We see the same thing if we extend the treatment over a week or even longer. Actually, this figure here is from a acute low back pain trial where people were treated for 6 weeks with oxycodone or placebo. In this case, there isn't even a non-opioid control. And what you can see is that even at 6 weeks, the people on placebo, their pain ratings are a little bit lower. And after a year, this is significant. They're actually doing better. And we see similar effects for chronic pain. It's just that it's not that opioids don't work, it's that they're not clearly better. But this doesn't match clinical experience, and there are millions and millions of people worldwide still on opioids for these types of conditions that might be treated equally well with non-pharmacological methods or non-opioid analgesics. And so these results really do defy clinical experience. And I'll show you one example of that I really like. This is actually a group in Oslo, and I don't know them, but they ran a couple of RCTs because they do molar extractions, which of course are very common. A lot of people have them, and they're relatively standardized. And they didn't find that their clinical experience was reflected in all of the literature, because they felt, as they say, we found the lack of additional benefit of added codeine, a weak opioid, confounding relative to extensive clinical experience. So in their experience, when people struggled, they gave them codeine and they did better, right? But so this is what many clinicians will say. But what these people did is they ran the RCTs, and here are the results. This is from a 200-patient trial. You can see that if you treat people after molar extraction with placebo, in this case, they really didn't get much of a relief over the 6 hours that they ran the study. But the clearly best treatment was the one that was just paracetamol and ibuprofen at the group level. All right. So opioids are a little bit disappointing, I would say. Certainly, having worked with opioids for a long time, I thought, well, they really, they should be better because they act on the endogenous opioid pain relief circuit, right? Well, so as we've seen, there is a pain modulatory circuit. It, contains these on and off cells. And there's also a nice literature of PET studies indicating that the bigger the change in the opioid receptor binding, the bigger the pain relief. So all of the background literature really indicated that, yeah, so if we block endogenous opioids through an antagonist such as naloxone or naltrexone, we should uncover more pain. So we meta-analyzed the literature. So this is data from 67 papers, 2,706 participants. And on average, we do see a significant effect. It's just that it's really small. So Hedges G of 0.18. And when we translate this into 0 to 100-point pain intensity scale, we have an increase of 2.8. So whatever is happening, it doesn't seem to be very large in general. So here's part of the force plot. So basically, it doesn't seem to matter whether we measure pain intensity, tolerance, unpleasantness, or the threshold. Doesn't seem to matter what modality the pain stimulation is in. It actually also, interestingly, doesn't seem to matter if pain is intense. We define this as above a 6 or less than a 6, and it doesn't seem to matter whether we have women or men. There is a little bit more pain with the opioid blockade, but it is rather underwhelming. And actually, if you look in the literature, it's really not clear what happens in rodents. So I wound up asking some colleagues who work on preclinical models, and it actually typically turns out that if they give a large dose of naloxone or naltrexone, their rodents don't seem to be more pain sensitive either. And there is the available literature on clinical pain also doesn't seem to indicate that if you block endogenous opioids, that you unmask a lot of additional clinical pain. But what about placebo effects and other non-drug interventions? So here's our plot. So each of these circles is an effect size from a study. And what we see is that when there is no intervention, there is a very tiny effect or a control intervention. We do see some effect with placebo hyperalgesia, but it's really variable. And we see this across pretty much all of the studies. We don't see much of an effect for stress-induced analgesia. Condition plane modulation, there's nothing. There is a clear effect for RTMS analgesia, but that's 3 studies. So we need more data from this field. But given this context, I thought we'd zoom in a little bit on the placebo hyperalgesia, because we had a wonderful reviewer on this paper who said, you need, what if, you're not seeing it, you're not unmasking any additional pain because the manipulation didn't work. And we actually went through and did a sensitivity analysis when we removed the papers where the placebo induction just isn't successful under non-naloxone conditions, so under saline conditions. And yeah, we actually moved the G up from 0.5 to 0.8. So I would say, having meta-analyzed the entire literature on what endogenous opioids do for pain in humans, I would say they appeared to help drive expectation effects. It's still very variable, but I would say this is probably a credible effect. I will, however, highlight that, again, when we think that opioids primarily do things for pain, there is a literature suggesting that opioids signal social reward and social expectations and humans, and this is from a meta-analysis we ran, just on feeling socially connected to others, where the mean effect is very small, but still larger than the mean effect we find on pain. Okay, so we've gone through and we've seen that there isn't really very much empirical support for this notion that opioids are the most powerful analgesics. And also not really that endogenous opioids or that opioid blockade will unmask a lot of additional pain. And then what's interesting is that there is a equally strong belief, I think, with opioids when it comes to reward, that opioids cause euphoria. And in all of our studies, and we do not see that. We do not see an increase in positive effect on the group level when we give people opioid agonists. And similarly, when we give antagonists, we don't see a decrease in positive affect. And interestingly, we have exactly the same pattern for stress. So that opioids are thought to be, really powerful in regulating stress, but we do not see any increase in stress relief when we give people opioids. And similarly, when we block endogenous opioids, and this is also from other groups, we don't see an unmasking, stress doesn't get worse. And I think one of the reasons, one of the things that's going on here, and one of the reasons that we have these really pervasive beliefs about opioids that are not supported by the literature, is that there is a lot of variability. So you'll always find a few people who do fit your expectations. So this goes for pain relief, it goes for opioid effects on positive effect and on stress relief. All right. Just zoom briefly in on this notion that opioids cause euphoria. We've run a number of lab studies where you don't see any mood regulation. There was a study from 1955 that gave people heroin, and on average, they really didn't like it. One of the participants said, for instance, I felt irritable, shaky, unsteady, nauseated, and angry at the doctor for making me sick. And similarly, when we block endogenous opioids, we don't see a shift in mood. I will show you a little bit more about this because we also measure this, as I mentioned initially, on the operating table. And these are RCTs that are among the shortest you'll ever hear about, because we are there when the patient is on the operating table right before they're having surgery. So it's a high stress context. And they get an opioid, and then we wait 1, 2, or 3 minutes, and we ask them, how do you feel before and after? And what we see is clear intoxication, but very modest anxiety relief. These are open label opioids in these studies. So you would expect, just from placebo effects, I think I would have expected a larger decrease in anxiety, even though we are at, 1 or 2 minutes. And we also see, even more striking given the opiate label administration, no opioid, no mood boost. People do not feel any better when we give them lunch. Actually, we see consistently now, we replicated this in one RCT, and we're about to unblind a really large new one with different opioids. So we don't see much anxiety relief, and we see absolutely no improvement in how people feel. But there is a really large variability, and about a third of people feel better or feel worse. All right. So what about opioids for stress? I've sort of given you the preview by saying, right, they don't really work for stress. But there's a large literature from epidemiology as well was preclinical data indicating that when you get stressed, you are at greater risk for addiction. So we tested this in the lab by doing a Trier stress task, or because we did it within subject, we did this iOS singing task, gave people an opioid drug, and then we thought they would feel relief. And then we measured how much they wanted to take the drug again. We did this in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study in 66 people. And these are the main results. So we got people reasonably stressed. This is the stress induction, and then they get an opioid, and then we do additional stress testing. And it's just to show that we gave them a decent dose of an opioid, so they feel reasonably high, and but they still have a large cortisol response. But what we shift upwards when we give them the stress. They work to have more of the initial sampling dose. So we have the effect that we expected, that after stress, people want more drugs. This effect seems to be driven by the men in our sample. We don't actually see it on average in the women. But crucially, from my point of view, it's not because of relief, because we don't see any evidence at all that the opioids induce positive affect or even relieve the negative affect that we've induced from the stress induction. And in this slightly whirlwind tour, because I have some new data that I want to show you that I think is really cool, I will just mention that in this recently completed study from Isabel Meyer and Anne Willems, that actually Jan, who's here with a really cute co-listener, is also a collaborator on. They ran basically fair extinction learning, so safety learning with and without opioid blockade, and found identical behaviors. So essentially, people are equally willing, or not just willing, but able to learn that something is safe after we block at least 90% of their endogenous opioid receptors. All right. So all of these opioids don't do what you expect, don't really match with what you expect, right? And it's partly what we expect is partly because of quotes like this one. Having opioids is like being hugged by Jesus. Or I find this one really striking. These are, I remember feeling like I was exhaling from holding my breath for my whole life, just intense relief from suffering. So that's not what we're seeing in the data at all, right? But this is what people are saying. So there is a discrepancy here. So I've thought, long and hard about this with a lot of really smart people in the lab and elsewhere. And I think I would summarize what we know about what determines how an opioid, will affect you. So obviously there are some effects from the kind of drug, administration method, and dose. But the context that you're in and the expectations are really, really vital for these types of effects. And then it's also important who we're testing and what their experience is. Because opioid users typically like opioids. And actually, a lot of the studies that test how opioids make people feel, and stress relief, and even actually the analgesia, are from restricted to people who are already opioid users. And so this could be due to relief of withdrawal effects, as we'll get back to in a minute. And then there's this other thing. So whenever I, give talks on this topic, people come up to me afterwards and they say, "Oh, but I had opioids and they were amazing." And yes, I do not doubt it. But most of the time, when you have opioids, certainly if you're willing to tell, a perfect stranger in a scientific context, it's because you had opioids for pain. And of course, you love pain relief. We all love pain relief, right? That doesn't mean that everyone loves opioids all of the time. All right, to the final part of, of my talk here, because I recently started reading up on what happens when you take people off opioids, if they're on opioids for a while. And for those of you who are really old like me, you may remember this film Trainspotting, which has a really gruesome scene where the main character goes into a horrible withdrawal. So opioids are known to cause really horrible withdrawal symptoms. If you wonder what they are, this is the main scale. So people typically feel anxious, they sweat, they get like snot everywhere, goosebumps, hot, like temperature issues, they get pain, they might vomit, stomach cramps. It sounds like a really horrible experience. However, And this is something that is studied, it turns out, in a class of RCTs that you guys might know about because of your, studies on expectation effects, but that were relatively new to me. So I'll explain them briefly. There's a RCT drug or design called Enriched Enrollment Randomized Withdrawal Studies. So what they typically do, this is from Gimbel et al., just there. They basically take people who have either been on opioids for pain or even other drugs, and they get them off their medications, and then they enroll them in the trial, and they do what's known as an open label titration. So it's similar to what would happen if you went to your physician and you needed to start a new drug. So you get the drug and then you try it and then you come back and they, shift the dose around until they get you to a point where you feel like the medication is doing its job. And in the majority of the trials I'll be talking about, this would be taking pain patients and getting them to approximately below a 4 out of 10. On a pain intensity score. And what's special about these trials is that they try to mimic clinical practice because of this evidence that opioids, in these large group level studies do not outperform other treatments such as non-opioid analgesics. And the reasoning is that, well, opioids work for some people. My friend Chad Brummett calls these the people who respond to opioids, he calls them the unicorns, because every physician I've ever talked to has at least one patient. They're like, oh yeah, we shouldn't really give people opioids for chronic pain. It's not really supposed to work. But I have this one patient, it's an older lady. She's been on this dose forever. Whenever we reduce her, she gets worse and she's not increasing, because one of the main problems with opioids over time is that typically the effect habituates and you develop what's known as tolerance, and then you need to increase the dose. And so what they're doing in this type of trial is trying to retain only the people who seem to have a positive response to the opioids, and who don't have too many side effects that they can't continue in the trial. So in the study that I'll be mentioning to you, basically they did a meta-analysis of these types of trials with opioids. And so they started with approximately 8,000 people, and they lost about 3,000 in the titration phase. And that seems to be pretty typical. 30 to 40% do not seem to show a very good response, even in the few weeks of an opioid trial. But then what happens? So now you've just given everyone opioids. That's not RCT, right? So what happens is then they take half of the people off. And they do this, and then they compare people on placebo or the opioid that they're already on for 12 weeks. And the difference between the placebo and the drug is thought to be a better indication of the efficacy of the drug, because it's now restricted to the people who showed efficacy in the first place. Okay, so hopefully you'll understand why I'm so obsessed with this. So this is a paper. This is, all right, we'll get to the figure legend. I've got Claude to make this figure from this meta-analysis, because it's all in a table. This is from John Farrar's work. He managed to get a contract with the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, and they get all of the data from the pharmaceutical companies that try to market their drugs. So these are 12, I think, trials with hundreds of people in each, that basically use this type of design with different opioids: buprenorphine, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, morphine, oxycodone, tapentadol. And what you're seeing in the figure is basically the median sort of SAL score. So that's the withdrawal effect. So the anxiety and the snot and the sweating and everything. And then in bar B is the moderate to severe withdrawal, and then C is just the people who have really severe withdrawal effects. This is during the 12 weeks when they're taken off this opioid that they have been on typically for 8 to 10 weeks. And what's fascinating here is, so these are the people who got randomized to placebo, so they were taken off. But look at this. These are the people who were randomized to stay on their opioid. Right? Talk about expectation effects. These people should have absolutely zero withdrawal effects because they are on the same dose that they've been titrated to. And they have almost exactly this the same with, withdrawal effects. So if you start, if you look here on the left, the median scores are almost exactly the same with the exception of like 2 or 3 trials. And then there's a slightly clearer pattern for the severe withdrawal. But essentially, it seems that most of the withdrawal that people report in these trials is entirely expectation. So, and this isn't even the point of the paper. So I feel like I need to write to John Farrar and be like, you need to release this, you need to come and present it at the, placebo conferences. This is like massive nocebo effects. And it's really useful actually for clinical practice because taking people off opioids is considered incredibly difficult, in part because all of the clinicians are really afraid of withdrawal effects. And so they, so even, just the clinicians in our group have already started saying, wow, I'm going to start talking to my patients differently after this. Okay. So that was my most recent, discovery. This is stuff that I've only been looking into in the last few weeks. So to get to the summary, basically my take homes is, unsurprisingly, I'm sure for this audience, expectations matter for opioid effects. Opioid prescribing is still perhaps more eminence-based than evidence-based. And the belief in the unique power of opioids can lead to overprescribing, but on the other hand, the belief that opioids make you feel great and cause euphoria can actually lead to underprescribing. So I'm not here to suggest that we shouldn't use opioids in clinical practice. It's just that I'm basically here to just say it would be great if we would follow the scientific evidence instead of just the opinion of whoever is the most senior person in your clinic. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think opioids are overrated for pain, mood, and stress. But they might be underrated for what they do on our motivation and behavior. And I think it's nice to go back to Cambridge and look at, this is a paper from one of his recent reviews. So he's basically thought of as the source of this belief that opioids are primarily important for hedonics. But when he maps out the structures in the rodent brain, all of these green areas are areas where he reports clear direct motivational effects of opioid microstimulation. And only the red dots are areas where he reports changes in the experience to the extent that we can measure this in rodents. So to summarize, I would say we should keep studying opioids because we really want, to do better in terms of avoiding side effects and giving people pain relief. And we should start studying what they do for how people behave. So then I'm just going to say thank you. This is the team. These are not just lab, but actually our extended research group that we call Affective Brains. But obviously a lot of these people did a lot of the work that I presented. So thank you very much.